A restaurant manager refused to serve a black woman, shocking everyone in the diner. But what happened next was unbelievable. Karma struck back instantly, and the manager learned a lesson they would never forget. This story is about more than just one moment of discrimination. It's about standing up for what's right and seeing justice happen in the most unexpected way. Imagine being treated unfairly just because of who you are. That's exactly what happened here. But this woman's courage and what followed will leave you speechless. Before we get into the full story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Don't forget to share and subscribe for more stories that inspire and show why fairness and respect matter. Let's dive in. The diner was a small-town staple, a cozy place where locals came for comfort food and familiar faces. Its warm lighting, checkered tablecloths, and gentle hum of conversation gave the illusion of a welcoming environment. But for Marcia, that welcome quickly turned cold. Marcia was a professional black woman, dressed neatly in a tailored blazer and slacks, her confidence evident in the way she carried herself. She had been traveling all day for work, navigating meetings and long drives, and was now ready for a simple meal before calling it a night. Entering the diner, she hoped to find a bit of comfort in the bustling restaurant. At first, it seemed like any other small-town eatery. Families gathered in booths, a group of teenagers laughed over milkshakes, and a waitress darted between tables with steaming plates of food. But as Marcia walked to the counter to place her order, she noticed subtle shifts around her. Conversations quieted. A few heads turned her way, and the cashier's friendly demeanor faltered. Behind the counter stood Bob, the manager. In his mid-50s, with a stern face and a no-nonsense attitude, Bob had been running the diner for years. To the regulars, he was a reliable figure who kept things running smoothly. But Bob had his unspoken rules, and one of them seemed to surface now as he glanced at Marcia. When Marcia greeted the cashier and began to order, Bob interrupted. His tone was polite, but there was an unmistakable chill in his voice. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we're full tonight. You'll have to come back another time." Marcia paused, taken aback. She looked around the diner. At least 5 tables were empty, and a few more were being cleared. "It doesn't look full to me," she said calmly, gesturing toward the open tables. "I can wait if that's the issue." Bob's jaw tightened. "Those tables are reserved for regular customers," he replied, his voice firm. "It's our policy." The room grew tense. A few patrons exchanged uneasy glances. Others quickly looked away, pretending not to notice. Marcia stood her ground, her voice steady but edged with quiet determination. "I'm not asking for anything special. Just the same service you give everyone else." The cashier fidgeted awkwardly, avoiding Marcia's gaze. Bob's face hardened as he crossed his arms. The air in the diner felt heavy, and the faint clink of utensils onto plates seemed louder than ever. Marcia could feel the weight of every eye in the room, some watching with curiosity, others with silent judgment. Just then, the door swung open, and in walked a tall, sharp-dressed man carrying a leather briefcase. He had a commanding presence, and his eyes scanned the room, quickly locking onto the scene at the counter. He paused, taking in the tense atmosphere, and then quietly chose a seat near Marcia. He didn't say a word, but his presence alone was enough to shift the mood. No one in the diner could have guessed that this stranger was about to change everything. Marcia stood at the counter, her calm expression masking the discomfort brewing inside. She had dealt with situations like this before, but that didn't make it any easier. Bob, the manager, had just told her the diner was full, but it was obvious this wasn't true. Tables were visibly empty, and no one else seemed to be waiting for a seat. "You're saying you can't serve me because the tables are reserved?" Marcia asked, her voice steady but firm. "That's right," Bob replied, his tone clipped. "Our regulars always come first." Marcia glanced around the room, noting how the other patrons reacted. Some looked away quickly, avoiding her gaze as if they didn't want to get involved. A few whispered among themselves, their faces reflecting unease. The family, sitting in the corner, shuffled uncomfortably, while the teenagers by the jukebox fell silent, their laughter fading into the charged air. "I understand if there's a policy," Marcia continued, her voice calm but unyielding. "But I don't see anyone waiting. If there's an issue, I'd like to know what it is." Bob sighed, his irritation barely concealed. "I don't have to explain myself, ma'am. I already told you, those tables are for regular customers." The tension in the room thickened. Marcia's composure remained intact, but her presence alone seemed to challenge everything Bob was trying to assert. She wasn't raising her voice or causing a scene. Instead, her quiet insistence made his flimsy excuses feel even more transparent. "I'd like to speak with the owner," Marcia said. "If this is your policy, I'd prefer to confirm it with them." Bob's face turned red. "I am the manager here," he snapped, his polite tone slipping. "I make the decisions, and I've decided that we can't serve you tonight." At this point, the tall man who had entered earlier shifted in his seat. He had been quietly observing the exchange, but now he leaned forward slightly, as if preparing to intervene. The other patrons began to notice him too, their curiosity piqued by his calm but authoritative presence. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice breaking the silence. "I couldn't help but overhear. Is there a reason this lady isn't being served?" Bob turned to him, clearly annoyed. "This doesn't concern you, sir. It's a matter of policy." The man raised an eyebrow. "Policy?" he repeated, his tone cool. "I see plenty of empty tables, and I didn't notice you asking anyone else if they were regulars when they walked in." Bob's jaw clenched. "Like I said, we have rules here. It's not your business." The man stood up, and the room seemed to hold its breath. He wasn't overly tall, but there was something commanding about the way he carried himself. His tailored suit and briefcase hinted at someone important, though no one could guess just how much influence he had. "Actually," the man said, his voice calm but firm, "it is my business. You see, I write about restaurants for a living. I'm a regional food critic, and part of my job is evaluating not just the food, but the treatment of customers. So far, I'd say this experience isn't reflecting well on your establishment." A ripple of murmurs swept through the diner. Bob's face turned from red to pale in seconds. He stammered, I didn't know. Look, this isn't what it seems." "Oh, it's exactly what it seems," the man said, stepping closer. "You refused service to this woman for no valid reason. And as far as I can see, it's based solely on her appearance. That's unacceptable." Marcia, standing at the counter, felt a surge of gratitude but also kept her focus. She turned to the man. "Thank you for stepping in, but I'm curious to hear what Mr. Bob here has to say for himself." Bob swallowed hard, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The entire diner was now silent, every patron watching the scene unfold. The whispers had stopped. Even the teenagers by the jukebox looked tense, their eyes darting between Bob and the critic. Look, Bob stammered, "it's not what you think. We have certain standards here, and we like to keep things comfortable for our regulars. It's not personal," the man echoed, his voice laced with incredulity. "Do you realize what you're saying? Comfort for your regulars doesn't mean excluding someone based on your assumptions about them. That's not comfort. It's discrimination. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Bob opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. His earlier confidence had crumbled under the weight of the critic's calm but cutting remarks. One of the patrons, an older woman sitting near the window, finally spoke up. "He's right," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This isn't right, Bob. She has every right to be here, just like the rest of us." Another customer chimed in. "I've been coming here for years, and I've never seen you treat anyone else like this." The tide was turning, and Bob knew it. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but none came. Even the cashier looked away, unwilling to meet his gaze. Marcia took a deep breath, her voice steady, as she addressed the room. "I didn't come here looking for trouble. I just wanted a meal after a long day. But it's moments like these that show us who we are, how we treat people when no one's watching." The critic nodded. "Exactly. And now, Mr. Bob, everyone is watching. So I suggest you decide how you want to be remembered." Bob's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. "I'm sorry," he muttered, though his apology lacked conviction. Marcia tilted her head slightly, studying him. "If you're sorry, then show it. Change the way you treat people. Not just me, but anyone who walks through those doors." The critic stepped forward, his expression serious. "And for the record, I'll be including this incident in my review. It's not just about holding you accountable. It's about setting an example for others." The room remained silent as the weight of the moment settled over everyone. Marcia stood tall, her quiet dignity unshaken. The critic returned to his seat, and one by one, the other patrons began to clap. It wasn't just for Marcia. It was for the principle, for justice, for the courage to stand up against what was wrong. Bob stood frozen, his face a mixture of shame and regret, as the applause echoed through the diner. Marcia turned to the critic and nodded. "Thank you," she said simply. He smiled faintly. "No, thank you. You handled this with grace. I just did my part." As Marcia finally sat down at one of the empty tables, the waitress hurried over, her face apologetic. "What can I get you, ma'am?" she asked softly. Marcia glanced at the menu, then looked up with a small smile. "I'll take the house special, please." And just like that, the diner slowly returned to normal, though the lessons of that evening would linger far longer. The diner's tension felt like a storm waiting to break. Bob, the restaurant manager, was now visibly flustered as the food critic stood firm. Marcia sat quietly, her expression calm but determined, a stark contrast to Bob's unraveling composure. The other customers were watching closely, their murmurs filling the silence with a charged energy. Bob cleared his throat, his voice strained as he attempted to regain control. "Look, sir," he addressed the critic, "I think you're misunderstanding the situation here. We run a good, clean establishment. I just didn't want any trouble." The critic raised an eyebrow. "Trouble? By trouble, do you mean serving a paying customer who simply wants a meal? Explain to me how that's trouble." Bob stammered, his words jumbled. "It's not like that. We just, well, we try to maintain a certain environment for the comfort of our regulars." The critic's gaze sharpened. "A certain environment? Comfort for whom, exactly? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've singled out this woman for no reason other than the color of her skin." Gasps rippled through the diner. A few customers shook their heads, their discomfort now giving way to open disapproval. One woman whispered to her husband, "I can't believe this is happening in our town." Bob's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "That's not fair," he snapped. "You don't know me, and you don't know how we run things here." The critic didn't flinch. "You're right. I don't know you, but your actions speak louder than anything you could say. And right now, they're telling me everything I need to know." Marcia finally spoke, her voice steady and composed. "Mr. Bob, I don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. All I asked for was a table and a meal, just like anyone else. Why is that such a problem?" Her words, simple and clear, struck a chord. A young couple seated near the counter exchanged glances, visibly uncomfortable. The older woman by the window leaned forward, her face etched with concern. It was as if Marcia's calm demeanor made the injustice even more glaring. Bob, caught between his growing frustration and the undeniable truth of the situation, threw up his hands. "Fine," he said, his tone defensive. "Maybe I overreacted, but I didn't mean anything by it." The critic stepped forward, his voice cutting through the room. "Overreacted. This isn't just an overreaction. This is discrimination, plain and simple. And whether you meant anything by it or not, it's unacceptable." The room was silent again. Even the sounds of forks on plates and whispered conversations had stopped completely. All eyes were on Bob, who seemed to shrink under the weight of the critic's words. Then the critic turned to the other patrons. "I have a question for everyone here," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "If this was your wife, your sister, your friend, how would you feel if she was treated this way? Would you sit quietly and let it happen?" The room collectively held its breath. A man sitting with his family near the back raised his hand. "It's wrong," he said, his voice steady. "No one should be treated like that. It doesn't matter who they are." Another customer, a young woman by the jukebox, nodded. "We all come here to eat and relax. Everyone deserves that, no matter what." The critic turned back to Bob, his expression unrelenting. "Do you hear that? Even your own customers understand what you refuse to see. This isn't just about one woman tonight. It's about the principles your business should stand for." Bob looked down, his earlier bravado now completely gone. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he seemed lost for words. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he mumbled. "I was just trying to—" "I don't know." Marcia tilted her head slightly, her calm gaze never wavering. "If you didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said gently but firmly, "then maybe it's time to take a step back and ask yourself why it happened in the first place." The critic nodded in agreement. "That's a start, Bob. But words aren't enough. What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again?" Bob looked up, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. But there was none. The diners who once avoided eye contact were now staring directly at him, their silent judgment undeniable. "I'll do better," Bob said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll make changes, training, new policies, whatever it takes." Marcia's expression softened slightly, but her resolve remained. "I hope you mean that," she said, "because people like me don't come here to fight battles. We come here to enjoy a meal, just like everyone else. But when things like this happen, we can't stay silent." The older woman near the window started clapping. Slowly, others joined in, their applause growing louder. It wasn't just for Marcia. It was for what she stood for her courage in the face of injustice. The critic nodded approvingly, his sharp gaze softening. Bob looked around the room, his face a mixture of shame and realization. He gave a small, hesitant nod. "I'm sorry," he said, louder this time. "To you," he added, looking directly at Marcia, "and to everyone here. I'll do better." "I promise," Marcia nodded back. "I hope you keep that promise." The critic stepped forward once more. "This isn't just about words, Bob. Actions speak louder, and believe me, I'll be watching." With that, he turned to Marcia and extended a hand. "You handled this with incredible grace," he said. "If there's anything I can do to support you, just let me know." Marcia smiled faintly as she shook his hand. "Thank you. I think tonight was enough." The applause died down, and the diner slowly returned to normal. Bob retreated to the back, looking like a man who had just faced his worst fears. Marcia finally sat at a table, the waitress rushing over with a menu and an apologetic smile. As the critic left the diner, he paused by the door, turning to glance back at Marcia. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave him a small nod of gratitude. The storm had passed, but its impact would linger. For the diners who witnessed it, for Bob, and most importantly, for Marcia, this night was a turning point. The diner was quieter now, but the air still buzzed with tension. Bob had retreated to the back, his earlier arrogance replaced with a humbled silence. The critic returned to his seat, scribbling notes into a sleek leather notebook, while Marcia finally sat at a table, her calm demeanor masking the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Yet the story wasn't over. As the waitress brought Marcia a glass of water, the critic stood once more and addressed the room. "I think it's important," he began, his voice calm but commanding, "that we talk about what just happened here. Because moments like this aren't isolated. They happen every day in places just like this." The other diners looked up, their curiosity piqued. Some nodded in agreement, while others sat uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. The critic continued, his tone shifting from firm to personal. "I've seen discrimination in many forms over the years, and I understand how deeply it can cut. Not just in the moment, but for years after." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on Marcia. "You handled this with more grace than most people could. But what struck me the most was your strength. You didn't let anger take over. You didn't back down. That's something to be admired." Marcia, who had been quietly sipping her water, looked up. There was gratitude in her eyes, but also curiosity. "Thank you," she said softly. "But may I ask, why does this mean so much to you?" The critic hesitated for a moment as if weighing his words carefully. Then he sighed, his voice quieter now. "Because I've seen this before. My grandmother faced something similar when I was just a boy. She was turned away from a restaurant, different town, different time, but the same story. She didn't fight back. She just walked away, and I could see how much it hurt her." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "That day changed me," he continued. "It made me realize how much injustice can be hidden behind polite smiles and fake rules. I promised myself I'd speak up whenever I saw it, and that's why I'm here today." Marcia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Your grandmother must have been an amazing woman." "She was," the critic replied with a faint smile. "And I know she'd be proud of you for standing your ground tonight." Just then, Bob reappeared from the back, his steps hesitant. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by a look of quiet regret. He approached Marcia's table, his hands clasped in front of him like a schoolboy ready to confess. "Miss Marcia," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. Truly. What I did tonight was wrong, and I can't take it back. But I want to make it right." Marcia studied him for a moment, her face unreadable. "What does making it right mean to you, Bob?" He swallowed hard. "It means learning from this. It means making sure this never happens again. Not to you, not to anyone. I'll start by updating our policies, and I'll make sure my staff and I get the training we need to treat everyone fairly." The critic leaned back in his chair, watching the exchange with quiet interest. "And what about your regulars?" he asked, his tone pointed. "You seemed very concerned about keeping them happy earlier. What will you tell them?" Bob looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the faces of his customers. Some looked supportive, others wary, but none seemed openly hostile. "I'll tell them the truth," he said finally, "that we were wrong, and that we're going to do better. If they don't like it, then maybe they're not the kind of customers we want." The older woman near the window smiled and clapped her hands together softly. "Good answer, Bob," she said, her voice kind but firm. "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we fix them." The room seemed to breathe easier after that. The tension that had gripped the diner for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of hope. Marcia offered Bob a small smile, her earlier steel softening just a little. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "I hope you mean it." "I do," Bob replied earnestly, "and I'll prove it." The critic closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "Well, Bob, I'll be watching to see how you follow through. You've got a second chance. Don't waste it." Bob nodded solemnly. "I won't." As Marcia finally settled into her meal, the room began to hum with life again. The whispers faded, the clink of silverware returned, and the energy shifted to something lighter, something hopeful. For the diners, it was a moment of reflection. For Bob, it was a turning point. And for Marcia, it was a reminder that standing up for what's right can create ripples far beyond the moment. The critic, preparing to leave, stopped by Marcia's table one last time. "You've inspired more people tonight than you know," he said quietly. "Don't ever stop." Marcia smiled, her strength shining through. "Thank you," she said. "And thank you for standing up with me. We all need allies." The critic nodded, tipping an invisible hat. "Take care." As he walked out into the night, the door swinging shut behind him, the diner seemed brighter somehow. It wasn't perfect, but it had taken a step forward. And sometimes that's all it takes to begin real change. The diner was quiet again, but the weight of what had happened lingered. Bob stood behind the counter, watching Marcia leave. He knew his apology was just the first step. Change wouldn't come from words alone, and the eyes of the customers around him seemed to carry that message loud and clear. Marcia paused near the door. Bob hesitated before following her. "Ms. Marcia," he called, his voice softer than it had been all night. She turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. "I just wanted to say thank you," Bob said, his words uncertain. "Not just for hearing me out, but for showing me something I needed to see." Marcia regarded him carefully, her expression unreadable. "It's not about me showing you anything, Bob. It's about what you decide to do with what you've learned tonight." Bob nodded slowly. "I'll do better," he said. "That's a promise." Marcia offered a faint smile. "I hope you do." She walked out into the cool night air, leaving the diner behind. Inside, the other customers began to speak quietly, some offering their thoughts to Bob as they paid their bills. An older woman approached him, her voice kind but firm. "You did the right thing by apologizing, Bob. Now make sure it counts." A young man at the jukebox chimed in. "This place has always been great, but tonight showed us it could be even better. You've got a chance to make that happen." Bob nodded, their words sinking in. The next morning, as he sat at his desk, he made a call. "Hi, this is Bob from the diner. I'd like to schedule diversity training for me and my staff. Can we start as soon as possible?" Over the next few weeks, changes began to take place. New signs welcoming all customers were placed in the windows. Bob and his staff attended workshops on unconscious bias and inclusivity. The regulars noticed the shifts too. One day, a family walked in, a black couple with 2 young children. They hesitated at the door, but Bob greeted them warmly and seated them himself. For Bob, this was more than a business decision. It was about proving to himself and others that he was willing to grow. The story spread quickly, fueled by the food critic's review. In his article, he recounted the incident and praised the diner's efforts to make amends. "This wasn't just about one night," he wrote. "It's about recognizing when we've been wrong and committing to do better." People who had once avoided the diner began to visit, drawn by the changes. Some regulars grumbled, but over time even they began to see the value of a more welcoming space. The diner became a symbol of change, not just for Bob, but for the entire town. Marcia returned a few weeks later. This time, when she walked in, she was greeted warmly by everyone. Bob personally welcomed her and led her to a table. "It's good to see you again," he said, his tone genuine. "Tonight's meal is on us." Marcia looked around and noticed the small but meaningful changes. The energy in the room felt lighter, more inclusive. She nodded approvingly. "You've come a long way, Bob." Bob approached her table. "If you have any suggestions on how we can improve, I'd love to hear them." "You're doing well so far," Marcia said. "Just keep going." The changes at the diner rippled outward. Customers shared their own stories of overcoming prejudice, and conversations about fairness and inclusion became more common. Bob, once a man set in his ways, became an advocate for change, sharing his journey with other business owners in town. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong," he would say, "but it's harder to live with the consequences of staying that way." For Marcia, the experience became a story she often shared in her work. It was a reminder of how speaking up, even in the face of discomfort, could lead to meaningful change. She often reflected on the words the critic had spoken that night. "Actions speak louder than words." Months later, the diner had become more than just a place to eat. It was a place where people felt they belonged. The once limited customer base had grown into a diverse crowd, and the atmosphere was one of warmth and inclusion. Bob had kept his promise, proving that even deeply ingrained habits could be changed with effort and intention. One afternoon, Marcia stopped by again. Bob greeted her at the door, his smile genuine. "Welcome back, Miss Marcia. Your usual table." "Thank you, Bob," she said. As she sat down, she looked around and saw people of all backgrounds enjoying their meals. The critic's words echoed in her mind once more, a testament to the impact of standing up for what's right. As she left the diner that day, the sunlight felt brighter, the air lighter. Change, she realized, might start with one small step, but its effects could reach far beyond what anyone imagined. The story didn't end when Marcia walked out of the diner that night. News of the incident spread, amplified by the critic's review. His article, which recounted the confrontation and praised Marcia's grace, became a rallying cry for fairness. People across town and beyond began to talk about what happened, some commending Bob's apology, others questioning if real change was possible. A week later, Marcia received an unexpected call from Bob. His voice was quiet, almost unsure. "Miss Marcia, I wanted to thank you again. I know I hurt you, and I'm working to make it right." Marcia was skeptical. "What steps have you taken so far?" Bob explained that he'd hired a diversity consultant, held training sessions for his staff, and updated the diner's policies to ensure inclusivity. "But it's not just policies," he added. "I'm trying to change the culture." Marcia appreciated his efforts, but replied firmly, "Change isn't a one-time fix, Bob. It's something you have to work on every day." "I know," he said, "and I'd like you to come back, to see the changes and tell me if we're heading in the right direction." Marcia agreed, and when she returned the following week, she was greeted with warm smiles and a few soft claps from the customers. Bob stood near the door, nervous but genuine, and led her inside. The signs on the wall now explicitly welcomed all customers, and the staff wore pins that read, "Everyone belongs here." A framed pledge of inclusivity hung prominently on the wall. The critic was there too, sipping coffee with a knowing grin. "Looks different already, doesn't it?" he said, tipping his cup toward Marcia. Bob stood in front of the small crowd and addressed the room. "I want to thank everyone here, especially Ms. Marcia, for holding me accountable. That night was a wake-up call. I know we've made progress, but this is just the beginning." The room filled with quiet applause, and Marcia smiled, feeling a sense of pride, not just in herself, but in the way the community had responded. Bob approached her table, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for giving me another chance. I'll keep working to prove it." "Good," Marcia replied. "Actions speak louder than words." As Marcia left the diner, she looked back one last time. The once tense and exclusive place now radiated warmth and openness. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. For Bob, for the staff, and for the town, this was a turning point. And for Marcia, it was a reminder of the power of courage and persistence. She walked away, knowing that the ripple effects of that night would extend far beyond the diner's walls. The story of what happened at Bob's Diner quickly became more than just a local tale. It resonated with people across social media, sparking conversations about fairness, justice, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Marcia's quiet strength and Bob's eventual accountability showed the power of courage and redemption. As Marcia left the diner that day, she reflected on how a single moment of confrontation had led to real change. The diner had transformed into a place where everyone was welcome, and Bob had shown that even deep-seated attitudes could be challenged and changed with effort and humility. This story isn't just about one night in a diner. It's a reminder that small acts of resistance can create ripples that inspire others to stand up, speak out, and do better. Change starts with individuals, but it spreads through communities. What would you have done if you were in Marcia's shoes? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where standing up made a difference? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that shine a light on the courage it takes to make the world a better place. Thank you for being part of this journey. Together, we can make a difference. See you in the next story.